Thomas took away my best joke, telling you I'm from Alabama. Because, I usually tell people, I know from my name you think I'm not from around here, and everybody thinks, oh yeah, you're from someplace in Eastern Europe. And I say, no, I was born and raised in Alabama, right? I was asked to talk to you about voter fraud and election integrity, which is a very important issue in North Carolina, and North Carolina's been at the front of the battle on this. But I want to tell you what got me into this. More than 20 years ago, actually 25 years ago, I volunteered to be a poll watcher. It was the first time I'd ever done that. It was in an election county commission race down in Atlanta. And, there's a lot of great Republicans that do that kind of work. We had a lot of Republican women from the women's groups who do much of the work for the Republican Party who volunteered for this. But they did not want to get assigned to where I got assigned to, which was one of the worst housing projects in downtown Atlanta. So I ended up there. Now, this was a general election. In a general election, it doesn't matter what party you're in, right? Because you just get a general ballot. And I get to this polling place, and I see that the people working behind the registration desk, when somebody comes in, a voter comes in to check in, are asking them, well, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Before registering them and giving them a ballot, which of course is highly illegal, and you can't do that. Now, it got stopped because I went outside, called it in, and the county election division sent somebody down to stop this from happening. But if I hadn't been there as a poll watcher, this would have gone on all day, and given the political makeup of this particular precinct, there was no telling whether this would have intimidated people from being able to vote. And that's what got me interested in this. Now, the left and their friends in the mainstream media will tell you there's no voter fraud in the U.S. It's not something you need to worry about. They are kind of like the great scene from The Wizard of Oz where the wizard tells Dorothy, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Well, they don't want you to pay any attention to what goes on behind the voting curtain. Now, the facts of this are that, look, we're a great republic, but we have an unfortunate and long history of voter fraud. And it goes back to our very beginnings. I'll give you a quick example. In 1742, riots broke out in Philadelphia on Election Day over claims that German immigrants were being used to illegally increase vote totals. Now, if you think that things like that haven't changed, I would remind you of what happened in Philadelphia in 2008 when the new Black Panther Party was standing at a polling place throwing racial epithets at white voters who were coming into this precinct and trying to intimidate them and keep them out of the polls. I wrote a lot about that case. I know the lawyers of the Justice Department that pursued that case. And as you know, what happened was when the Obama administration came in, they dismissed the case, weren't interested in pursuing it. Now, I think things have gotten better there. 2 years ago, another organization I'm associated with, Public Interest Legal Foundation, we actually filed a lawsuit against Philadelphia under the National Voter Registration Act because we wanted to know if they were actually cleaning up their voter rolls, because the law requires you to do that. Well, what did we discover? We discovered that they have literally thousands of felons and non-citizens on the voter rolls. And when we said to them, well, these people are ineligible to vote, you got to take them off the rolls, Philadelphia said, well, we don't care about that, and we're not taking them off the rolls. And if you think it couldn't get any worse, last fall, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania suddenly resigned with no explanation, but it might have something to do with the fact that a state legislative committee was having a hearing, and at that hearing, a former employee of the DMV said that for years, DMV has had a glitch in its licensing system such that people who come in, now these are non-citizens who are here legally, but a non-citizen who's here legally can get a driver's license in every state. And the glitch is that when non-citizens come in to get a driver's license, they can all register to vote, and the state doesn't catch it and doesn't do anything about it. And he estimated that based on a secret comparison that the state had done, that there may have been as many as 100,000 non-citizens on the rolls in Pennsylvania. Now, you think about how close we've had elections in that state. That's still being looked at, but we have filed another lawsuit against the state of Pennsylvania to get those records and to get that internal comparison that was done. Because why? Because the state refuses to turn it over. Every time I talk about voter fraud, I like to give a couple of examples of that. So let me give you some examples of actual cases. And I'm going to start with one that Shamus may know about. Where's Mr. O'Neill? Oh, there he is. Because he used to work for the guy who was almost the victim of this. In 1982, they had a statewide election in Illinois. There was a big governor's race on. The incumbent was a Republican named Big Jim Thompson. That's who you work for, right?
That's correct.
And he was being opposed by Adlai Stevenson III, the grandson of Adlai Stevenson, the perennial presidential candidate. Now, going into the election, Big Jim Thompson had a 15-point lead in the polls. But on Election Day, when the votes were cast, he only won by 5,000 votes out of the entire state. Now, nobody thought anything about it, said, well, that's just politics, until about 2 weeks after the election. And 2 weeks after the election, a disgruntled poll worker called the FBI field office and said, I can tell you all about the fraud that occurred in that race. And it turned out that he had been made a promise that if he helped steal votes on Election Day, he would be given a city job. And after the election, the precinct captain called him up and said, sorry, but you're not getting the job. Which is a great lesson on if politicians really ought to keep their promises. So he told the FBI agent all about how they had stuffed the ballot box in that particular precinct. So the FBI opened up an investigation. I wrote a paper about this for the Heritage Foundation, a case study on election fraud. And I ended up interviewing not only the chief FBI agent, now retired, who had led the investigation, but I also talked to the U.S. attorney who prosecuted the case, who's still a lawyer in Chicago, and I also talked with the Maine Justice Department lawyer who'd worked on the case as a very young new lawyer at the Justice Department. They convened a grand jury, a federal grand jury, and at the end of the grand jury's investigation, they did something that is very unusual. You know, grand juries operate in secrecy. This grand jury decided to publish its report. And its report is available, and you can read it. The estimate of the number of fraudulent votes cast in that election, and remember, this is 6 years after Mayor Daley is dead. Okay? But his machine is still working. The estimate by the U.S. attorney was that 100,000 fraudulent ballots had been cast in that election. Eventually, every single agent in the FBI field office in Chicago worked on the case. They had to pull in lawyers from Washington, D.C. to help them with it. And the FBI agent told me that they prosecuted, they indicted 65 individuals. All of them were convicted except for one guy who died and one guy who was declared mentally incompetent and couldn't sit trial. He told me they could have indicted and convicted many, many more people. They ran out of resources. Now, let me tell you what they found, because what this shows is all the different ways that fraud occurs in elections. There was coercion of the disabled and elderly in nursing homes and elsewhere, or the outright theft of their ballots. There was impersonation fraud at the polls of registered but absent voters, because they have a voter ID requirement. Non-citizens voted in the election. At least 24, I think, were convicted. There were false people who were registered at false addresses. Fraudulent absentee ballots, vote buying, particularly of the homeless, who would get picked up in vans, taken to polling places. They would vote, and the going rate at the time, remember this 40 years ago, was $2. Votes by 3,000 dead voters. Double votes by 31,000 individuals who were registered twice in different parts of the city. And really interesting, the FBI field office not only compared the voter registration list with all kinds of other lists, he decided to get a list from the state corrections department of people serving in the state penitentiaries in Illinois, and he discovered that there were thousands of votes cast by these prisoners who were in jail at the time, and there was actual altering of votes in the polling places. Now, I like to cite another case that shows you how fraud can occur because it's kind of embarrassing to the New York Times. And I thought of this at the time that, Indiana passed a voter ID law that ended up before the U.S. Supreme Court in 2008. And at the time, the New York Times wrote this big story about how, voter ID is a terrible idea. It's just there to suppress votes, and there's no voter fraud that requires this. Well, interestingly enough, I found a New York Times headline about a voter fraud story that they apparently forgotten that they had covered. The headline was, "Boss Tweed is gone, but not his vote." And the story was, in the mid-1980s, the district attorney of Brooklyn, Kings County, discovered that for 14 years, there had been a successful voter fraud conspiracy in Kings County that had cast literally thousands of fraudulent ballots in both state legislative and congressional races. And here's how they did it. At the time, New York had something unique, which unfortunately we now all have, which is they had mail-in voter registration. As you all know, we adopted that with the motor voter law. And so what these conspirators did is they sent in false voter registration forms, because you mail them in and the person gets registered. And the way they did it was very smart. They would make up names, but they would use real addresses, and they would use the addresses of big apartment buildings and big condominiums. Because what would happen is a registration form would come in, the person got registered, they would send the registration card to that address, and the mail would go to some big condo complex, real address, but a name of somebody who's not there. And so the general manager of the condo complex would just throw it out, say, this person doesn't live here. They also did this. New York is one of those states where if you want to be on the ballot as a candidate, you've got to get a petition signed by a certain percentage of registered voters. And so these folks would go around, they'd get the voter registration list, and they would go knocking on people's doors saying, I'm here, I'd like you to sign a petition to get such and such candidate on the ballot. And sometimes people would come to the door and they'd say, oh, well, that person doesn't live here anymore, they moved out of state. Or, I'm sorry, that person that registered, they passed away. Well, the guys doing the petition didn't notify election officials about this. They would make a notation of that. And on election day, the local state grand jury heard from witnesses who said they were part of crews of 6 to 8 people. Each crew was given a list of names of people who were dead, people who had moved out of state, and they were sent from polling place to polling place to polling place, voting in the names of all these voters. And they got away with this for 14 years. Now, the grand jury did something, again, unusual. They published their report. And at the end of their report, it says, one of the recommendations is, the state really ought to put in a voter ID law. Now, do you think New York did that? No. So do you think that might still be a problem in New York? Yeah, and I'll tell you how we know it might still be a problem. Mayor de Blasio, remember, got elected in 2013 in New York? Okay, well, the New York City Investigations Division was concerned about the election department of New York because they had heard that a lot of nepotism was going on there. Members of the election board were hiring members of their family. They also got reports that the voter registration list was really bad in New York City because the city wasn't doing anything to take off people who've moved out of state and died or become ineligible to vote for something else like being in prison. So on the day that de Blasio got elected as mayor, they sent their undercover agents into polling places all over the city to ask for the ballots of people who they knew were dead, had moved away, or were unable to vote for another reason. In every single case, they were handed a ballot. And they tried to make it as easy as possible for their undercover agents to get caught. I mean, for example, they had one undercover agent who's a young African-American woman who went in to ask for the ballot of a Caucasian woman in her late 80s who was dead. In every single case, they were handed a ballot. Now, they didn't actually vote for any of the people on. They made up names and then handed the ballot back. In only one case did the undercover agent get caught. One of the undercover agents went in to vote in the name of a person who was a young man who's in the state penitentiary and therefore not eligible to vote. And he was not able to get a ballot because the woman working at the registration desk happened to be that prisoner's mother. Now, that brings us to another case I want to talk about, because this case tells you about the kind of problems we really have today with non-citizens all over the country registering and voting. And I'm not talking just about people who are here illegally, but people who are here legally too. I think a lot of people forget that we're now, in our 22-year anniversary of a U.S. congressional race where there was an actual investigation done that showed that hundreds of non-citizens had voted. Y'all remember B1 Bob Dornan? He was the incumbent congressman in Orange County, California. And in 1996, he was challenged by a Democrat named Loretta Sanchez, who only recently retired from Congress. And she only won by a little less than 1,000 votes, 979 votes. She won that election by. So Dornan challenged the election. Now, I don't know if you all realize this, but if you challenge a congressional election, losing candidate, that's investigated by the House Administration Committee. House Administration Committee has jurisdiction over elections. So they investigated it. And what the House Administration Committee did is they got a hold of the Orange County voter registration list, and then they compared it with INS records. Okay? And they found that in a race won by 979 votes, there was clear and convincing evidence that 624 votes had been cast by non-citizens. There were another 124 improper absentee ballots, and there was circumstantial evidence of 196 non-citizens also voting. Now, they still said Loretta Sanchez was the winner because she still had a margin of, like 30 votes? A very small number. But here's the elephant in the room, if I can use this. Remember, INS records are only going to have two kinds of records. They're going to have records on non-citizens who are here legally, and therefore have applied for a visa or a permanent residency, so they're in the INS database. And they're going to have records on illegal aliens who've been caught and detained. And it was very clear that there's a pretty strong possibility, and here's what the committee said. If there is a significant number of documented aliens in INS records on the Orange County voter registration rolls, how many illegal or undocumented aliens may have registered to vote in Orange County? We don't know, but I have a feeling that race probably was stolen by them. And the problems in California have just gotten worse. California's never done anything about this. And you all may know California issues driver's licenses to illegal aliens. They just issued a report last year. They issued 1 million driver's licenses, and combine that with the fact that California is now one of the first states in the country that has put in an automatic voter registration law. So if you go in and get your driver's license, they don't ask you, do you want to register to vote? They automatically register you to vote. And the state leaves it up to the now registered voter. They say, well, it's their responsibility to then contact us and say, well, I shouldn't be on there. Now, I got so tired of hearing the New York Times and the Washington Post say there's no voter fraud in the country that 2 years ago at the Heritage Foundation where I work, we started a database of voter fraud cases. Now, I don't have a lot of resources. The only people I have working for me are, we have interns, college interns coming in. So I don't have this huge staff that I can use to completely research American history or go through every state court record in every county across the United States or search every newspaper. I don't have the means to do that. And we put in a really strict rule. I knew the left would be looking at this. So we didn't want to put in newspaper articles where somebody says, well, I think I saw something happening at my polling place. We decided the only thing we would put into it are proven cases. Cases where somebody's been convicted in a court of law for committing fraud, or a case where a judge, for example, has overturned an election because of fraud in the underlying election. We're up to 1,132 cases, of which 938 criminal convictions, 48 civil penalties, judicial findings, official findings, etc. And that is the tip of the iceberg. Because I will tell you that a lot of prosecutors don't want to prosecute these cases. I have personal experience with that. A lot of election officials, when they discover stuff like this, they don't turn it over to law enforcement. I'm going to give you some examples of that. And if you don't have the tools in place to detect it, how are you going to know about it? I mean, go back to the Dornan case. We would never have known that 800 non-citizens voted in that election except for the fact that Dornan contested the election. We would never have known that 100,000 fraudulent ballots were cast in that Chicago election except for one guy breaking the code of silence and calling the FBI. In May of 2017, the Public Interest Legal Foundation issued a report on the state of Virginia, where I live now. And what the foundation did was actually really simple. They sent a letter to every county in the state and said, we want the voter registration records of every registered voter that you've taken off the voter rolls because they contacted you and said that they were not a U.S. citizen. Now, a lot of the counties didn't want to give us that information, so we had to sue them. So remember, this isn't going through and actually verifying the citizenship of all the people who are registered to vote. These are just people who just contacted and said, ooh, I really shouldn't be registered. They found 5,556 non-citizens had been removed from voter rolls in Virginia, but not before they had cast 7,500 ballots. Now, Virginia is a big state, but in the last dozen years, we've had 2 statewide attorney general's races decided by less than 1,000 votes, one of them by 300 votes. And the last one, unfortunately, gave us a Democratic AG. In last year's elections, Virginia has off-year elections. In last year's elections, the party that would control the state house came down to one race. The 94th district, which is Newport News, Virginia. It was a tied vote. And then how did they decide who won it? They put the names of the 2 candidates in film canisters, the kind nobody uses anymore, put them in a crystal bowl and pulled one of them out. And thank goodness the Republican won. But I mention that because one of the counties that we got information from, one of the jurisdictions was Newport News. Newport News makes up almost the entire 94th district. They had taken 200 non-citizens off the rolls in recent years. So we don't know how many more there are there. And here's a question I got for you. You all know the answer to this. Of the 5,556 non-citizens who have been taken off the rolls. Now remember, registering and voting as a non-citizen is not only a violation of state law in every state, at the state level, it's a felony under federal law. Now, do you think that a single one of those files was sent to law enforcement officials for investigation? No. So there's I got a database with a little over 1,100 proven cases. Here's a potential for over 5,000 voter fraud cases that will never be in my database because they never got turned over to law enforcement. And I actually used to be on a county election board in Virginia, Fairfax County. It's the biggest county in the state. And we have a 3-person election board. And when I got on the board, I said, well, do we ever check DMV records so that we can see if people who got a driver's license or not citizens are also registered to vote? And the clerk said, well, no, we've never done that. So we did that. And we discovered in just one check 279 non-citizens who were registered to vote in our county. About half of them had cast ballots. We took them off the rolls, and over the opposing vote of the Democratic member of our electoral board, I made a motion that we send that information to the local county district attorney and to the U.S. Justice Department. This is 2011 when Eric Holder's running it. Okay. And I should say the district attorney in my county is also a Democrat. Those files fell into a deep black hole. Never heard from the U.S. Justice Department, who apparently had no interest in investigating and potentially prosecuting very easy cases to prosecute. How big is this problem? Well, we don't know, because there's never been a systematic nationwide search done to look at this problem. As you all know, the president last summer appointed a presidential advisory commission on election integrity that was supposed to look at that. I actually was appointed as a member. The progressive left went crazy when the president did this. And we wanted to check this out. One of the ways to check out this problem was we asked each of the states for a copy of their voter registration list and a copy of the voter histories, which is public information, so that we could start doing comparisons to see, for example, how many people are registered in more than one state and voted in more than one state. Well, all these states went up in arms and say, we're not giving you this information. It's an outrage that you're asking for it. The funniest incident that I saw of this was Terry McAuliffe, former Virginia governor, former head of the DNC, holds a news conference in which he says this is just outrageous that we're asking for this information, and no way is Virginia going to give it to us. This is intended to suppress the vote. And if you go to the website of the Virginia Department of Elections, like in almost every other state, you can buy this information. That's where candidates and political parties get the list of voters they send all their mailings out to. And I can guarantee you that when Terry McAuliffe was running for governor, he no doubt bought from the state exactly the same information we were asking for. But we were never able to do that because so many states, not only said they weren't going to give it to us, but they were going to oppose us in court, and we didn't have the resource to sue them. How big is the potential problem? In 2012, the Pew Foundation, Pew Foundation is not exactly conservative. They actually did a study of voter registration lists across the country, and they found 24 million voter registrations with significant errors and problems. 2.8 million people who are registered in more than one state, and 1.8 million people who are dead, who are still on the rolls. Now, how bad could this problem be? We got a great sample of this, and I'm telling you, this is one of the reasons that the left opposed the President's Commission. We had 2 hearings. One of them was in New Hampshire, and we had a witness in front of our commission who came forward. He's a software data guy. And here's what he did in conjunction with the Government Accountability Institute. The Government Accountability Institute is a private foundation in Florida headed by a guy named Peter Schweikert. Peter Schweikert wrote the book Clinton Cash, right? They went and got the voter registration and voter history lists from 21 states. Now, those 21 states represent about 17% of the registered voters in the country. The information that from the states, a lot of it's incomplete. So what they did is they went to this commercial data guy and said, we want you to supplement this information. And what that meant was, look, if they had the name, on your registration list, the counties have your name, your birth date, and your residence address, right? Well, you go to a commercial data house, and they got a lot more information on you once they got that. And what they did is they got the full Social Security numbers of all these registered voters. And then they did a comparison of these 21 states. And they compared people by last name, first name, birth date, and full Social Security number. So the idea that you're going to get two different Jim Smiths who are not the same, it's not going to happen. Okay. So what did they found in the 2016 election when Donald Trump got elected? They matched 8,500 individuals who had voted illegally in more than one state. 2,200 of those people voted illegally in Florida and another state. 2,200, that's 4 times the margin of victory of George Bush in the 2000 election. He estimated that if they extrapolated what they had done to all 50 states, there are probably at least 45,000 people who illegally voted more than once in the 2016 presidential election. Now, here's the other thing they found. They found 15,000 registered voters. Now, remember, it's the law in every state you have to be registered at your residence address, right? They found 15,000 people registered at post office boxes, public buildings, gas stations, vacant lots, basketball courts, parks, warehouses, and office buildings. Now, that's just plain reckless negligence by election officials. Because if you're an election official, what have you got access to in your county? You got access to tax records and all kinds of other records that are going to easily tell you whether a particular address is a residential address or not. And yet, these election officials aren't doing that. Heck, all you got to do is use Google Earth and get a photograph of the address that you're about to put into the computer of somebody who's just sent in a registration address, and you can see whether perhaps it's a vacant lot, which might give you a clue that there's a problem. Now, can this kind of thing make a difference in elections? Well, let's go back to the 2016 election with Donald Trump. Okay, you all know Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire by 3,000 votes, right? Very small number. And the Republican U.S. Senator Kelly Ayotte was beaten by 1,000 votes. Okay. Well, at our hearing in New Hampshire, Sean Jasper, he's the Republican Speaker of the New Hampshire House, testified that he had asked for some really interesting information from DMV and from the Secretary of State. Now, New Hampshire is one of those states where they have what's called same-day registration, right? So there's about a dozen states that have it. So on election day, you can walk into the polling place, register to vote, and you immediately vote. Now, a couple of years ago, to great controversy, the left was all up in arms about it. New Hampshire actually passed a voter ID law. So on election day, if you same day register and vote, you do have to show an ID. So here's the information that Speaker Jasper got. On November 8th, 2016, 6,500 people registered to vote and voted using an out-of-state driver's license. Now, it's very possible these are people who moved into the state recently. But remember, New Hampshire's got a law, like most states, that within 60 days of moving into the state, you got to trade in your out-of-state license for a New Hampshire license. So As of August 2017, so almost a year later, only 1,000 of the 6,500 people had gotten a New Hampshire driver's license. Only 3% of the remaining 5,500 had registered a car in New Hampshire. So in essence, you got over 5,300 people, 81% of the people who use an out-of-state ID to register and vote in New Hampshire, who a year later don't have a New Hampshire's driver's license and haven't registered a car in New Hampshire. Now, maybe some of these people are students who are ignoring the law, but 5,300? If those are people from Massachusetts who decided, hey, let's go across the line, we can make sure Hillary Clinton wins, they could have changed the outcome of that election, because only 3,000 for Clinton and 1,000 for the Republican. And is it easy to get up and cross the line? Well, Seamus told you I went to school at MIT in Cambridge, and we used to drive up there and go right across the line to the big liquor store they had in New Hampshire, because you didn't have to pay any sales taxes on it. I should say the drinking age was still 18 when I was in college. So how big of a problem is it? These two stories give you an idea of it. Another story that will give you an idea of it, and this may have affected North Carolina, is that in 2014, 3 professors in Virginia, two at Old Dominion University, one at George Mason, actually put out an interesting study. They are now pariahs in the academic community, which, as you know, is very liberal. What they did is they took a look at there's this thing done after federal elections called the Congressional Survey. It's done by a bunch of universities, and they survey tens of thousands of voters and ask them all kinds of questions. Based on this survey, these professors estimated that in the 2008 election, when Barack Obama was first won the presidency, that 6.4% of the non-citizens in the country may have voted in the election. 6.4% of all the non-citizens in the country may have voted in the election. Now, that may sound like a small number, but in their paper, they mentioned the fact that North Carolina, Obama only won it by 14,000 votes. And you have enough non-citizens in this state that if they voted according to that number, and the polling shows non-citizens vote about 80-20% Democrat versus Republican, non-citizens may have thrown the race for Barack Obama. They also mentioned Minnesota. And I mentioned Minnesota because there's voter fraud that affected every single one of you in this room. Because remember, 2008, Minnesota, one of the closest Senate races in U.S. history, right? Norm Coleman was the incumbent Republican, and on Election Day, he was declared the winner by a little over 700 votes. Al Franken, who now, thank goodness, is no longer in the U.S. Senate, right? Al Franken challenged him, got a very good legal team. 8 months later, he was declared the winner by the courts by about 300 votes. Well, if 6.4% of the non-citizens in the state voted in that election, that was many times his margin of victory. We do know it was also won by fraud. I'm not saying Franken did it, but after the election, a grassroots conservative group got a hold of the voter registration list for Minnesota, and then got a hold of the state corrections list, and did a comparison and discovered that in that election, 1,200 felons had illegally voted. That's 4 times the margin of victory of Al Franken. North Carolina, we have over more than a dozen voter fraud cases from this state. They include, some of these are cases where it's just one voter, takes advantage of the system. Like Pasco Parker. Pasco Parker is convicted in 2015 for voting in the 2012 election in North Carolina, Florida, and Tennessee. Now, was this discovered by election officials? No. It was discovered by Jay Delancey, who's sitting back there, with his voter integrity project. The election officials, they didn't discover it, and they wouldn't have discovered it if it hadn't been for his group. That's one guy. On the other hand, we have a case in our system that involved 41 convictions for vote buying in the western part of this state through an operation that the FBI did called Operation West Vote. We got another case in there, Lumberton, North Carolina, where the city council race was overturned in 2016, an election won by one vote. Why? Because they found that there were 20 registered voters who didn't actually live in the city. And again, that would never have been discovered except for an election contest. Another case we have, same thing happened in Pembroke, 2013. They overturned an election there because 30 fraudulent votes were cast. I got one woman who in 2014 voted her husband's absentee ballot a couple of months after he died. Another guy convicted in 2003, he was a Canadian citizen who voted in several elections in the state. I mean, there's all kinds of voter fraud like that exists. And what the left does to try to say this is not important is they'll say, oh my goodness, there were 1 billion votes cast in the country. And all of these cases amount to like, 1/1000th of 1%. But we don't hold elections where 1 billion votes are cast in this country. We hold state, county, city, town elections all the time where a very small number of people vote, where the difference in the margin of victory can be 1 vote, like some of these cases, 12 votes, or not more than that. And that's the reason why in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID law, unlike North Carolina's, and said it's perfectly constitutional. And here's what the court said about this. Examples of such fraud have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists, and not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but it could affect the outcome of a close election. And that is the key. I will tell you that voter ID is not the only solution, but I'll just mention this real quickly. Most of the lawsuits filed against state voter ID laws have lost. You'd never know that from the press. But there are voter ID laws, for example, in all the states that surround North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Virginia, South Carolina, every single one of their voter ID laws survived court challenge. Georgia's voter ID law has been in place since 2008. In the lawsuit that was filed against it, claiming there was a violation of the Voting Rights Act, it was finally dismissed by the judge in that case, who was a Jimmy Carter appointee, Democratic judge. I got to read you this. Although plaintiffs claim to know of people who claim that they lack photo ID, plaintiffs have failed to identify those individuals. The failure to identify those individuals is particularly acute in light of the plaintiff's contention that a large number of Georgia voters lack acceptable photo ID. The fact that the plaintiffs, in spite of their efforts, have failed to uncover anyone who can attest to the fact that he or she will be prevented from voting provides significant support for a conclusion that a photo ID requirement does not unduly burden the right to vote. In that case, they couldn't come up with a single person who'd be unable to vote because of the law. Exact same thing happened in the Indiana case. They couldn't come up with a single person who would be unable to vote because of the law. And how you hear all these claims that, oh my God, voter ID laws keep people out of the polls, they won't be able to vote. That is not true. And the reason we know it's not true is because, look, Georgia's law has been in place for 10 years. We got 10 years worth of turnout data from the state. And I can tell you, I've written papers where I went and got the official certified turnout data from the Secretary of State's office and looked at, well, what happened after the voter ID law went in place? And Georgia, by the way, because it's a former Section 5 voting rights state, they maintain their voting records by race. So in every election, you know how many blacks voted, how many Hispanics voted, how many whites voted. In their first election, 2008, after their voter ID law went in place, when you compare it to the prior presidential election, the Democratic turnout in the state went up over 6 percentage points, the fifth biggest increase of any state in the country. The overall turnout in the general election was the second biggest increase in turnout in the entire country. The black turnout went up, if you can believe this, 42%. The Hispanic turnout went up 140%. The white turnout went up only 8%. Now, whenever I come out with those numbers, a lot of people who are liberals in the audience don't listen to that. I say, oh, well, yeah, but Barack Obama was on the ballot. Yeah, but remember what I said. They had the second biggest increase in the nation with a voter ID law in place. That's above, all these states don't have photo ID laws. So obviously it didn't matter. And in the 2010 election, 2010, remember, midterm congressional elections, Barack Obama was not in the ballot. Black turnout went up 44%. Hispanic turnout went up 66%. White turnout went up only 11%. Exact same thing happened in Indiana in the 2008 election when their photo ID law was in place for the first time. In fact, guess who won Indiana in 2008? First Democrat to win the state since the early 1960s. Barack Obama. Indiana in 2008, with their new photo ID law in place, had the largest increase in Democratic turnout of any state in the Union. So the idea that this keeps people out of the polls is it's just not true. The data shows that. All right, I've been talking for quite a while. I probably should end this, right? I want to read you something because this really says a lot about this issue. Do you guys remember a former Democratic congressman named Arthur Davis? Congressman from Alabama, member of the Congressional Black Caucus. In fact, he was, I can't remember if it was the first nominee. He may have been the second person to nominate Barack Obama at the 2008 Democratic Convention. He wrote a op-ed in the Montgomery Advertiser, which is an African-American newspaper in Alabama, that caused great controversy. In fact, for a while, the Advertiser, I think, dropped the op-ed off of their webpage. Here's what he said. I've changed my mind on voter ID laws. I think Alabama did the right thing in passing one, and I wish I'd gotten it right when I was in political office. When I was a congressman, I took the path of least resistance on this subject for an African-American politician. Without any evidence to back it up, I lapsed into the rhetoric of various partisans and activists. The truth is that the most aggressive contemporary voter suppression in the African-American community, at least in Alabama, is the wholesale manufacture of ballots at the polls and absentee in parts of the Black Belt. If you doubt it exists, I don't. I've heard the peddlers of these ballots brag about it. I've been asked to provide the funds for it, and I'm confident it has changed at least a few close election results. Now, Alabama is a place where I've got another case study that I wrote in the 1990s. And I want to tell you about this case because this case is important for two reasons. And I'll tell you about this in just a second. In the mid-1990s, a young African-American Democrat called the FBI office in Birmingham. He had run for office for a county commission seat in Greene County, Alabama. Greene County, Alabama is one of the poorest counties in the country. I think they may hold the record for being one of the first county governments to actually file for bankruptcy. Okay? This is in what's called the Black Belt of Alabama because of the rich black soil there. It's 80% African American. It's a wholly Democratic county. And this guy had run for office on a reform ticket because this is a very corrupt county. And he ran on a reform ticket as a Democrat challenging incumbent Democrats. And he called the FBI office because he said, my election's been stolen. So the FBI launched an investigation. They eventually indicted and prosecuted and convicted almost a dozen local individuals, including, by the way, the treasurer of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And what they discovered was that these guys had been cheating elections for years, that they basically manufactured and stole hundreds of absentee ballots. And everybody in the county knew about it. And they came in and convicted them. And when this young African American, his next step after calling the FBI, who do you think he called? He called the NAACP, thinking they would come in and help him out. No siree. No, all the incumbents were their friends, and the NAACP went after the Justice Department and the FBI for investigating this. They said, your only intention is to suppress the black vote. In fact, they compared what the FBI was doing and trying to interview people to Gestapo tactics. But eventually, like I said, they convicted them, and guess what happened to turnout in Greene County after these people were convicted? It went up. That's right. And I actually talked to one of the FBI agents who was on the case, who told me he got this wonderful call from an elderly African-American woman after the convictions, who'd been one of the witnesses. She'd been involved in the civil rights movement, and she said to him, I want to thank y'all for what you did. I finally went and voted again because I feel like now my vote counts. And that's the biggest secret that the media doesn't tell you about. It is, look, often the targets of these fraud are poor minority communities. And the reason for that is, I can tell you, is from a case in Troy, New York, I wrote about just a couple years ago. 4 guys were convicted in Troy, New York of voter fraud. And what they were doing was going into poor neighborhoods and either stealing absentee ballots, requesting absentee ballots fraudulently in the name of voters, or forcing people to vote the way they wanted to when they got the absentee ballots. And one of the guys who was convicted was asked, well, why'd you pick the people in this neighborhood? And he said, well, they're the people least likely to complain about it or realize we've stolen their ballot. And that's the kind of fraud that goes on. Now, what can we do about all this? And I'll be happy to answer some questions. Look, this is a really problematic area. There's been some bad court decisions like the one in North Carolina. The left pours huge amounts of money into more than a dozen organizations to fight any effort to improve the election process. In 2016, George Soros gave one law firm in Washington, D.C., Perkins Coie firm. Perkins Coie firm is the firm that was Hillary Clinton's general counsel for her campaign. They handle almost all the Democratic candidates. They handle the DNC. They were given $5 million for one purpose and one purpose only, to file lawsuits against voter ID laws, including Virginia and Wisconsin. Now, fortunately, they lost. But I can tell you, there ain't anybody on the conservative side, donors pouring $5 million in to help fight those kind of lawsuits. But here's what ought to be done. We do need voter ID laws, not only for in-person voting, but also for absentee balloting, because absentee ballots are a tool of choice of vote thieves. There's a couple states that actually have that. Wisconsin, Kansas, Alabama. Their voter ID laws apply also to absentee balloting. The other thing that has to happen, although it's gotten tied up in the courts, is requiring proof of citizenship when you register to vote. That's one of the biggest requirements. I didn't mention this, but there's a thing called the Interstate Cross-Check Program. This was started by the state of Kansas about a decade ago. There's like 28 states that are members, and the way this works is once a year, each state who's a member, and North Carolina is a member, they send their statewide voter registration list to Kansas. Kansas runs a computer comparison, and each state, like North Carolina, gets back a list of all the people who are registered in that state who are also registered in another state. Now, there are a lot of states who aren't members, California, for example, but the other problem is that in Virginia joined when there was a Republican administration, but as soon as Terry McAuliffe came in, he said, you ain't doing anything with that information. Now, I'm not aware that North Carolina is doing anything with that information, too. What needs to be done? You investigate each case. You find out whether it's just a mistake, somebody moved, didn't let the new state know, or you check their voter histories and see, like Pasco Parker, are they voting illegally in more than one state? I checked the 2017 comparison for North Carolina. You know how many people you guys had registered in North Carolina and other states? 561,000 voters. The other thing that needs to be done is the states, and some states do this, most do not, is you use jury lists. How many of you have been called for jury duty? Okay. When you get called for jury duty, where do you think they get your name? The voter registration list. And what did you get when you got called for jury duty? You got a form in the mail, right? You had to answer a series of questions under oath and mail it back. And what was one of the questions on there? Are you a United States citizen? I heard from one county election official in Virginia that he has at least 1,500 people a year who are taken off jury duty because they say they're not U.S. citizens. Well, what ought to happen when that happens is the county court, should send that information to election officials so they can take the person off the list, and it should be sent to the DA so they can investigate it and see if the person did this intentionally and should be prosecuted. That's not being done. And the biggest thing is, when you get a case like this, prosecute these people. You know, there's just too many DAs that don't want to do this. Look, to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And I would add activism by hardworking Americans at the grassroots level. Because if you expect government to do this, they're not going to do it. So I would urge all of you to get involved, not only in getting your legislatures to pass the right kind of laws, but getting your county election officials to do the kind of things they ought to be doing. Simple things like, you know, when you get in a voter registration form, why don't you check Google Earth to see if it's a real address? Thank you very much.
Okay, at Duke University, the students are allowed to use their campus addresses to register to vote, which in my mind means that you could use your permanent home address to order an absentee ballot, whether you're in North Carolina or some other state. Doesn't this seem odd that you could use a temporary student address?
Well, look, students certainly are entitled to vote, and they need to choose where their residence is, whether it's their dorm or their parents' address. And they have the ability to do that. What they can't do is vote, of course, in both places. And the problem there is that the residency rules that a lot of states have are very vague and don't really define this very well. So I actually think that is a problem with students who may be taking advantage of that in voting in both places. There have been some pretty good reports that has actually happened. That's just another problem you got to deal with that would be dealt with if states were all part of this interstate cross-check program and they actually checked voter histories to find people who were illegally voting in more than one state.
Who decides that that's legal to do it that way?
The legislature defines what the residency requirement is for being able to vote.
Hi, Hans.
Hey, Jay.
Thank you for the props there on our group organization. They worked hard to find Pasco. It took us 2 years to get him prosecuted. There's some other props that you got tonight, though. I wanted to, if I could take a moment here. The jury disqualification trick, where you're finding people who disqualify from jury duty and checking them against the voter roll. We did that and found 500 in Wake County alone, and the left beat us senseless out of the deal, and it was a bad day. But then we went back to get more data because we knew what we wanted to find the next time around. And the court system in North Carolina reinterpreted their law.
And so you couldn't do it.
We couldn't do it. And we've tried to get a law to change it 3 times. And Representative Cleveland right here, who also was key to the interstate cross-check program, actually has a law right now that's over in the Senate side to get that fixed, House Bill 29, to get that fixed where we can make that public information. So I wanted to give some props to that. But the question I had for you, long ago when I first read you, you wanted observers. It was very important to get observers on the poll. Yeah. I'm concerned that with voter ID, as in Virginia and other places, the voter ID isn't really that good. You can go in there with a private business voter, a private business ID card. We still need observers, and I wonder if you could talk to the importance of observers. One other aspect to it was catching people right here in Orange County whose jobs at the polls were to check IDs, and they weren't doing it. And both parties too. And so we're concerned about, even with ID, good people will go back to sleep and say, there, it's fixed.
Oh, look, I agree, and I think at the start when I explained my first instance of what I saw in the polls, that shows you why there need to be observers in the polls. Just having an observer there is a deterrent. Listen, do y'all know why we even know about the new Black Panthers and what they were doing at the polling place in Philadelphia? Because a college student volunteered to be a poll watcher and was at that polling place and got out his iPhone and videotaped it. I actually met him at a conference, but we would never have known about it if that observer hadn't been there. So that is really, really important. And yeah, look, voter ID laws vary from state to state. Some of them are good. Some of them are pretty worthless. It just depends on the state. It depends on how the laws are written.
Thank you. Yeah. So Hans, two questions if
I can hear you.
Two questions if I may. In your extensive experience in elections activity, of the number of confirmed cases of voter fraud that you've witnessed and come across, what percentage are in favor of the Democrats?
I'd say it's probably about 80-20. You know, it's not that Republicans commit fraud too. In fact, I think one or two of the cases we have in North Carolina are Republican. But here's what you got to remember. Republicans were big committers of fraud in the 30s and the 40s when they controlled the big inner cities, Philadelphia, Kansas City. Those machines that regularly cheated, those were Republican machines. As you all know, what started happening in the 50s, accelerated in the 60s, and is now the case in every big urban center, is those Republican strongholds were all taken over by Democrats. So the machine politics that grinds out some of this fraud got taken over by Democrats. And unfortunately, and this goes back to the jury thing that Jay brought up, look, it just seems like some Democrats want to encourage this. And the best example of this is that in Virginia, the Virginia legislature is controlled by Republicans, passed a jury law. And all it said was that when somebody's excused from jury duty because they're not a U.S. citizen, they've died, or they've moved out of state, that information has to be sent to the local county election registrar so they can investigate and see if the person needs to be taken off the roll. Term McCall vetoed the bill. Now, what public policy reason can you come up with to veto that unless you want those kind of ineligible voters to stay on the roll? There isn't one. And that's unfortunately one of the big problems we have.
So, concerning what I'll call the occasional ad hoc local machine-based fraud,
right.
It's very difficult to get your arms around that. It's spread out all over the country, but what concerns me more, and maybe I'm naive in thinking this, is what I'll call systemic fraud. So the systemic fraud of California, and you mentioned the driver license issuance process where even non-citizens are getting admitted to voters' rolls.
Right.
And their only requirement is to either voluntarily say or not say whether or not they're a U.S. citizen. And then Maryland, which also concerns me, where non-citizens in many counties now are being allowed to vote in local elections and possibly in state elections. I mean, where do you see that going, and how damaging is that compared to what I'll call the ad hoc, occasional local stuff?
Well, I think that's really a problem when they allow non-citizens to vote in like school board elections, because what you're telling me they really adequately maintain two separate voter registration rolls? Come on. Plus, it devalues the value of citizenship. And I say that as somebody whose parents came here as immigrants, went through naturalization and became citizens. You should go through that process, make your commitment to America before you're allowed to vote. But folks on the left, they want to extinguish the line between citizens and non-citizens, and I think that's a very bad idea.
Hi. Gee, you've done a great job in telling us about the many instances of fraud and many convictions as well. I don't think you said anything much about the punishments. And I wonder if that isn't maybe key to the what can we do about it question. Do you not think that if we really prosecuted to the full extent of the law, federal felony, I think you said, and got people in jail and widely distributed photos of them in their jailbird jumpsuits at polling places from sea to shining sea, would that maybe not help solve the problem?
I do think a lot of judges don't take this seriously enough. You will often see punishments of community service and a fine. And the ultimate example of how this is viewed is some years ago there was a woman convicted in Ohio. You can Google this. Her name was Meloise Richardson. She was convicted, I think, of voting 6 times in an election. She was very frank. She voted for Barack Obama. She was actually caught. She was sent to jail, but she was let out supposedly for health reasons. And Al Sharpton, they were having a big voter rally in Ohio, and they brought her up on stage, and he hugged her, and they treated her like a hero because she had been convicted illegally of voting multiple times for Barack Obama.
Hi, Hans. I'm Dave Burton. We have a mutual friend, Paul Stam.
Oh, sure. I think you just have to talk loudly. Yeah.
Okay. Interstate crosscheck. I did some. I guess it's working again. I did some arithmetic using interstate crosscheck data a couple of years ago. They check not only voter registrations between states, they also check actual votes, the votes that occurred. In the 2012 general election, they matched North Carolina's voter roll in 2 ways against the other participating states. One was just by first and last name and date of birth. And they got 35,750 matches of first and last name and date of birth. Somebody who voted with the same name and date of birth in 2 different states. Now, for a name like John Smith, that's a lot of those can be coincidences. Right. Many of those 35,750, they were also able to match the last 4 digits of the Social Security number.
Right.
Okay. So if you do if you think about this, you realize when you match the last 4 digits of the Social Security number, you will eliminate 99.99% of the accidental matches.
Right.
So with 35,750, if they had the Social Security number last 4 for all of them, and they didn't, I don't know how many they did have, but if they had them all, and you additionally matched the last 4 of the Social, you would get only 3 or 4 accidental matches.
Right.
Okay? Guess how many they got? 765. So that's at least 750. Statistically proven 750 cases of two particular types of voter fraud in North Carolina in 1 general election. It was absolutely impossible to dispute the fact that there were at least 750 cases where the same registered person, ID, was voted in 2 states. The problem is there's no way to prosecute those cases in most cases because there's 2 kinds of fraud that can do that. One is the same person votes in 2 states. That's the name that you got. And in that case, the registered voter is the perp, right? Ought to be in prison. The other case is probably more common. It's like you said when they figure out who has moved out of the state but is still registered here, and they send somebody to vote for him. In that case, the perp is an identity theft victim. So you can't prosecute him if you don't know whether he's the victim or the criminal. So anyhow, how can we fix that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why you need voter ID, particularly for absentee balloting. Because if you vote in person in North Carolina and you decide to register and vote by absentee ballot in another state, if the other state requires an ID and you're using a false name, it's not going to completely stop that kind of fraud, but it's going to deter a lot of it.
Question I have, it appears that from the congressional level, there doesn't seem to be much interest in this. Looks like they're working, they got their jobs, and let the states run as they do. One thing, we do have a standard voting age of 18 years old. Could we have a national voter ID law?
Yeah, but it's never gonna get through Congress. Because anytime Congress basically ignores any kind of law having to do with election integrity because the Republicans know they can't get it through. The Democrats will put up a fierce fight about it. The last time this happened was in 2002. You all remember we had the 2000 presidential race, all the controversy over what happened in Florida. So Congress decided that we need to really reform the election process. They came up with the Help America Vote Act. That's the last federal law that was passed on this. And in the middle of the debate over this law, the Republicans tried to get a voter ID provision put in. The Democrats said, "We're not voting for that. If you put that in, it'll kill the bill. We won't pass it." And the compromise they came up with was a provision that is now the law that says that the first time you register to vote, you have to provide, and it gives a list, you have to provide either an ID or a bank statement or a utility bill or something like that, which, as you know, is worthless. I can produce for you a utility bill and a bank statement on my computer in probably 5 minutes. It looks like that. So, but the point is, this is an absolute non-starter in Congress. You just can't get it through given the current makeup of Congress.
I want to talk about the involvement of the churches, certainly in this area, perhaps elsewhere. For some time now, my church, which is St. Thomas More, and I believe that the Catholic churches in the diocese have been providing certificates of residency to the immigrants here, which can be used just like your DMV as a proof of a right to be registered. And the other part of the other part is just this week there were letters that were distributed at Mass protesting the actions of ICE in this area. So you have to watch and see what your churches are doing to be involved in politics.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that, and there are some church organizations that have been plaintiffs in the lawsuits that have been filed against voter ID laws, which I don't think they should be involved in, but that's something you have to do. That you have to talk to the churches about. So one more question, and then.
I was raised in the Virgin Islands in Puerto Rico, so fraud for me is normal. Now, I understand where Americans think of the seriousness of the voter problem, and it's reflected in the law because it's a felony. I'm going to suggest to you that the reward system needs to be changed. I would suggest that maybe we should investigate changing it to a misdemeanor and then charging a huge amount financially. In other words, like we do with automobile DUI, where it costs you $10,000 to get out of a DUI, and then taking the money and paying the prosecutor personally and putting some of the money in the hands of the state pension system, and then putting some money into a bounty. And that way we would then have an incentive to be able to catch these guys and prosecute them.
I just wanted to ask you to comment on 2 voter registration experiences I had. I requested a list of voters who were using Duke addresses. And it turned out that the Board of Elections had made a deal with Duke that they'd provide them with those addresses, Duke would, but that the Board of Elections would not give that information out to the public. When the Elections Board said, no, that's a public record, Duke withdrew all that information from the voter registration records. The second thing is we have a lefty project called participatory budgeting here in Durham, where a certain amount of money will be set aside for, I call it mob rule, where you get to vote on how the money will be used, but you can be as young as 15, or you don't have to be a citizen. And I'm wondering what you think about that as a potential indicia of voter fraud.
For it or against it?
Yeah, I can't say I'm much for that. You know, the District of Columbia is actually talking about lowering the voting age for actual elections in the city to 16. And you know, when I think back to what I was doing in high school, the idea of giving me the ability to vote is just a terrible idea. All right, I think that was it. Thank you very much.